The signal lasted 11 seconds. That was all. 11 seconds of broken audio, static, and one human voice screaming something that the automated relay station could not fully decode. Then the channel went dead. No follow-up, no rescue ping, no automated distress beacon, just silence, stretching out across the stars like something heavy had fallen and never gotten back up. The relay station logged it at 0342 ship time and flagged it as a priority transmission. By the time the flag reached the United Earth Navy's Deep Space Monitoring Center on Titan, 4 hours had already passed. The duty officer on watch, a young man named Corporal Ren Vasquez, stared at the log entry for a long moment. Then he picked up the comm and called his superior. Commander Yara Osei was already awake. She had a habit of waking before her alarm, a leftover from years of service on patrol routes where sleeping too deeply could get you killed. She listened to Vasquez read the log entry and felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear exactly, something quieter than fear. The kind of feeling that comes just before you understand something terrible. "Get the Undying ready," she said. "We're going to Kepler's Reach." The UES Undying was a scout frigate. Fast, lean, and not built for a fight. It had a crew of 42 and enough firepower to hold off a light patrol vessel if things went badly. Commander Osei had served on it for 3 years and trusted it the way a person trusts something that has kept them alive long enough. She stood on the bridge as the ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel and looked at what was left of Kepler's Reach. For a moment, she said nothing. Nobody on the bridge said anything. Kepler's Reach had been a colony of 4.2 million people. It sat on a planet called Aurum, named for the amber color of its sky when the light hit the upper atmosphere just right. The colonists had been there for 60 years. They had built cities, farms, schools, hospitals. They had a university. They had a professional sports league. They had children who had never seen Earth and called Aurum home with the same ease that people on Earth called their own neighborhoods home. What Commander Osei saw when the Undying came out of FTL was a graveyard. The planet still turned. That was the worst part somehow. Aurum still rotated on its axis, still caught the light of its star, still looked like a planet from the outside. But the surface was wrong. The cities were gone. Not damaged, not bombed. Where there had been structures and streets and parks and people, there was now a flat, blackened crust, as if something had pressed the surface of the world down flat with enormous heat and held it there until everything stopped moving. The orbital stations were debris. The defense platforms were clouds of shrapnel, drifting in slow arcs. The colony's small fleet of transport vessels had been reduced to expanding fields of twisted metal. There were no escape pods. There were no distress beacons from survivors in shelters or bunkers. The automated agricultural relay satellites, which should have been transmitting crop data on a 12-hour cycle, were all silent. "Run it again," Osei said, her voice very flat and very even. Her sensor officer, Lieutenant Dakarai Mensa, ran the scan again, then a third time. He looked at his screen for a long time before he answered. "No life signs, Commander. Not on the surface, not in orbit, not on any of the moons." He paused. 4.2 million people. There's nothing. Osei walked to the viewport and looked out. She had done this job for 16 years. She had seen damaged colonies, raided outposts, systems where conflict had left scars. She had never seen anything like this. This was not a battle. A battle left wreckage you could read, chaos you could trace. This was an execution. She turned to her communications officer. "Pull everything. Every satellite log, every relay buffer, every automated system that's still running. I want to know what happened here." It took 2 hours to piece it together. The picture that emerged was almost simple in its brutality. A Vreth Dominion fleet, numbering somewhere between 300 and 400 warships, had arrived at Orem, without warning and without any communication. They had not issued a demand. They had not given the colonists time to evacuate. They had opened fire on the orbital defense platforms first, then on the colony ships in dock, and then on the planet's surface. The entire operation had taken less than 6 hours from first contact to silence. The 11-second transmission had been the last thing the relay station picked up before the Vreth destroyed it too. The voice in the transmission had been a woman's. She was saying a name, over and over. Osei listened to it 4 times, and then made herself stop. The Vreth Dominion had issued an ultimatum to Earth's diplomatic corps 32 days earlier. They had declared that the Orem system fell within their sphere of territorial expansion, and that human presence there was unacceptable. Earth had been in the middle of formal diplomatic negotiations. Messages had been going back and forth between human envoys and Vreth representatives for 3 weeks. The talks had been slow, but had not broken down. There had been no indication that the Vreth intended to move this quickly. There had been no final warning. They had simply come and done what they did. Before the Undying left the system, Lieutenant Mensah found something on the surface. His long-range visual sensors, sweeping the wreckage of what had been the colony's main city, picked up a section of wall still standing in the middle of the burned landscape. Most of it was scorched black. But in one corner, sheltered by the angle of the collapse, a mural had survived. It was painted in bright colors, the kind of colors children use. It showed a family standing in front of a house, under an amber sky, with a sun drawn in the corner, and birds flying in a line. Osei looked at it for a long time. Then she looked away. "Set course for the nearest relay point," she said. "Full speed. I need to transmit to Earth." She wrote the message herself. She kept it short. She attached the sensor data, the satellite logs, the orbital imaging, and the 11-second transmission. At the end, she added one line of her own. "They answered diplomacy with extinction. There are no survivors. 4.2 million people. I am sending everything. Do with it what you will." She pressed send and stood at the comm station while the transmission went out, moving at the speed of light toward a subspace relay that would carry it across the distance to Earth. Then she walked back to her chair and sat down and stared at the viewport for a very long time. Behind the Undying, Orem kept turning, slow and quiet and completely empty. The amber sky, visible in a thin band along the day side of the planet, was still beautiful from a distance. If you did not know what had happened, you might have mistaken it for a world that was simply sleeping. And in 72 hours, Earth would know too. And then, everything would change. The transmission from Commander Osei reached Earth at 0917 on a Tuesday morning. By noon, the United Earth Senate had called an emergency session. By midnight, every major news network across 14 human-settled worlds was broadcasting the sensor footage from Kepler's reach. By the following morning, there was not a single human being alive who did not know what had happened to the 4.2 million people of Orem. For 48 hours, Earth grieved. People filled public squares and cities across the planet. They held candles and stood in silence and cried together, without knowing the names of the people they were crying for. It did not matter. They were human. The colony of Orem had been home to people who had gone out into the dark of space to build something new. And those people were gone now, and the whole of humanity felt that absence like a missing tooth, pressing at the empty space with their tongue and finding nothing there. Then the grief shifted. It did not disappear. Grief like that does not disappear quickly. But it was joined by something else, something that had no softness in it at all. It moved through the population the way a fire moves through dry grass. Slowly at first, touching one person and then another. And then suddenly all at once, everywhere, unstoppable. On the third day after the transmission arrived, the United Earth Senate voted. The vote was not close. Protocol Anvil had existed in a sealed document in the Senate's emergency archives for over a century. It had been written during a period of early space expansion, when human leaders, looking out at a galaxy full of unknown civilizations, had decided it was better to be prepared for the worst and never need that preparation, than to need it and not have it. Protocol Anvil was, in simple terms, a total war authorization. It gave the military unlimited manufacturing priority. It allowed the conscription of civilian freight fleets and shipyard workers. It suspended all diplomatic negotiations with the offending party. It released every cold storage military vessel from maintenance holds. And it placed the entirety of Earth's war-making capacity under the command of a single admiral, chosen by the Senate, answerable to no one until the crisis was resolved. They chose Admiral Hector Voss. Voss was 61 years old and had been retired for 3 years. He was a large man who had spent most of his career doing things quietly and without drama, which in the military usually means you are very good at what you do. He had fought in the Halcyon border conflict, the siege of Meridian Station, and the Cassian territorial crisis. He had never lost a fleet engagement. He had never lost a capital ship with its crews still aboard. He read the Senate's request, sat with it for about 4 minutes, and then accepted. "Tell me what I have," he said to the logistics officer who met him at the shipyard. What he had was staggering. Over the course of the previous century, as humanity had expanded outward and encountered other civilizations, a quiet doctrine had developed in the UEN's strategic planning divisions. It was never announced publicly. It was rarely discussed even in military circles. But it was practiced faithfully, year after year, administration after administration. The doctrine was simple. Build ships, store them, never stop. Every shipyard that had spare capacity was encouraged to fill it. Every mothballed vessel was kept in working order, rather than dismantled. Funds were allocated quietly, through budget lines that sounded bureaucratic and dull, and the ships accumulated in deep space dry docks, distributed across 24 systems. Nobody had ever intended to use all of them at once. They were insurance. They were the answer to a question nobody wanted to ask. But the question had been asked now, written in the ash of 4.2 million dead, and Hector Voss looked at the numbers and felt something settle in him like a stone dropping to the bottom of deep water. 700,000 warships. Not all of them were frontline battleships. Many were destroyers, frigates, carrier vessels, supply ships, and support craft. But they were all armed, all crewed once activated, all capable of deep space travel. The Vreth Dominion, at the height of its military power, could field roughly 90,000 vessels. They had been considered the 4th largest military force in the known galaxy. They had looked at humanity and seen a scattered, peaceful species with a fondness for diplomacy and a modest defense force. They had miscalculated on a scale that was almost difficult to comprehend. Across 14 human worlds and dozens of stations, the activation orders went out simultaneously. Shipyard workers who had been maintaining cold storage vessels in rotating shifts for years suddenly found themselves working around the clock. Civilian freight pilots received conscription notices and reported to military processing centers. Retired officers got calls, just as Voss had. Volunteer enlistment offices on every human world had lines stretching around the block before the morning was over. In deep space, watching from a respectful distance, a Thanari observation vessel recorded everything. The Thanari Collective was one of the oldest civilizations in this part of the galaxy. They had observed humanity for nearly 200 years, with a mixture of curiosity and cautious respect. Their chief observer, a being named Soth Ben Ara, filed a report to the Collective's council that was later described as the most alarmed communication in Thanari diplomatic history. The humans have activated their reserve fleets, the report said. All of them. The scale of what we are observing is without precedent. We recommend the collective immediately inform the Vreth Dominion that they have made a grave miscalculation. We do not believe the Dominion fully understands what humanity is capable of when it chooses to act as one. The collective sent the warning. The Vreth High Command received it, read it, and dismissed it. They had seen humanity's regular defense forces. They had run the numbers. They believed the collective was exaggerating, perhaps even trying to protect some political interest. The Vreth had fought 4 major wars and won all of them. They knew what a dangerous species looked like. They looked at humanity and did not see danger. They saw inconvenience. In a shipyard orbiting Mars, Hector Voss stood on the bridge of a newly activated battleship and watched through the viewport as row after row of vessels lit up their running lights in the dark. It was a sight that had no comparison to anything he had seen in his career. The ships stretched out in every direction, filling the space around the yard like a city made of metal and purpose. Further out, in other systems, he knew the same thing was happening, all of it moving toward the same moment. His aide handed him a status report. Voss read it without expression. Then he gave his first order. The flagship will be renamed the UES Kepler's Reach, he said, effective immediately. His aide made a note. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Then slowly, someone started to clap. It moved through the bridge crew quietly and without fanfare, just hands coming together, just people acknowledging what the name meant and what they were about to do. Voss did not clap. He looked out at the ships and did the quiet arithmetic of someone who has spent his life thinking about how conflicts end, not just how they begin. 4.2 million people. He was going to make certain that number was never repeated. He was going to make sure that every civilization in this galaxy looked at what had happened to Aurum, and then looked at what came next, and understood, in the deepest part of whatever passed for their instinct, that this was the cost, this was the bill, this was what it meant to confuse human patience for human weakness. In 6 days, the fleet would be ready to move. 700,000 ships, crewed, armed, pointed in one direction. The galaxy did not know it yet, but the drums had started. The first alien civilization to detect the human fleet was the Cathori Merchant Syndicate. Their long-range sensor array, positioned at the edge of the Orion Arm to monitor trade route activity, registered the FTL signatures of the departing human armada, and immediately flagged the data as a system error. The Cathori technician, who received the alert, ran a diagnostic, found nothing wrong with the equipment, and then ran the numbers again. When the numbers came back the same, she sat back in her chair and stared at the display for a very long time. She was looking at 700,000 ships dropping out of FTL travel in a coordinated wave across a front that stretched for millions of kilometers, all of them moving in the same direction, all of them accelerating toward Vreth space. She flagged it as urgent and sent it up the chain. By the time it reached the Syndicate's Senior Council, 3 other civilizations had already picked up the same readings. Emergency diplomatic channels lit up across the sector. The Fenari Collective issued an immediate advisory to all neutral parties, recommending they move their vessels out of the projected transit corridor. The advisory was calm in tone and very specific about the physics. It said nothing about what humanity was doing or why. It did not need to. Everyone already knew. Aboard the UES Kepler's Reach, Admiral Hector Voss received the reports of the alien sensor detections and read them without changing his expression. His communications officer asked if they should transmit anything to the observing civilizations. Voss thought about it for a moment. No, he said. We're not asking for anything, and we're not explaining ourselves. They can watch. The transit would take 6 weeks at the speed the fleet was traveling. 6 weeks of coordinated FTL jumps, resupply operations, and constant system checks on 700,000 vessels. The logistics alone were a staggering operation. Voss had 3 full Admiralty staffs working in rotation just to keep the fleet organized. Every day brought new challenges, new adjustments, new problems that had never been solved before, because no one had ever moved a force this size across this kind of distance. They solved every one of them. On the 4th day of transit, a live broadcast went out from the flagship. Every human world received it simultaneously. Every soldier, sailor, pilot, and support crew member aboard the 700,000 ships watched it on their personal screens or gathered in mess halls and common rooms to see it together. Admiral Voss stood in front of a camera on the bridge of the Kepler's Reach and spoke for approximately 4 minutes without notes. He did not give a rousing speech. He spoke quietly, in simple language, the way a person speaks when they have thought about something for a long time and have arrived at a place of absolute clarity. "You know why we're here," he said. "You know what happened. I'm not going to describe it to you again, because I don't think you need to hear it again. What I want to tell you is this. We are going to find the people who gave that order. We are going to hold them responsible in front of the whole galaxy. And we are going to make it permanently, unmistakably clear that the 4.2 million people of Aurum were not acceptable losses. They were not a message. They were not a bargaining chip. They were people, and they deserved to live." He paused for a moment. "We're going home to Kepler's Reach. Even if all that's left of it is ash, we're going home. And we're going to make sure this never happens again." He stepped away from the camera. The broadcast ended. Across the fleet, in hundreds of thousands of ships, people sat quietly with what they had just heard. Some of them cried. Most of them did not. Most of them simply looked at each other and then went back to their stations. On a frigate near the rear of the formation, Lieutenant Senna Okafor was not watching the broadcast with her crewmates. She was sitting alone in a small maintenance corridor near the engine compartment, which she had discovered early in the transit was one of the few places on the ship where she could be quiet without anyone checking on her. She had grown up on Aurum. Her parents had been there. Her younger brother had been there. Her childhood home had been in a city that no longer existed. She had joined this fleet because there was nowhere else she could think of to be. Not to be a hero, not because she was angry, though she was, but because she needed to be moving toward it rather than sitting still. Sitting still felt like it might swallow her whole. She sat in the maintenance corridor and listened to the hum of the engines and thought about the amber sky. Meanwhile, in the Vreth Dominion, the intelligence officer, Scarath 4, was having the worst week of his professional life. His original warning report, filed after the attack on Aurum and dismissed by High Command, had now been retrieved from the archive and was being circulated at emergency council meetings. Scarath 4 was not being credited with foresight. He was being treated as someone who had failed to make his warning clear enough. This was unfair, and he knew it. But he also understood that this was how institutions behaved when they had made catastrophic errors. They looked for someone inside who could absorb the blame. He ignored the politics and focused on the data. And the data was deeply alarming. 700,000 human ships. The Dominion's total military strength was 90,000 vessels, and not all of them were deployable on short notice. Some were stationed at border posts, some were mid-refit. Some were assigned to supply runs that could not easily be interrupted. Even if High Command pulled every available warship into a single defense formation, humanity outnumbered them by a factor of 7 or 8 to 1. He filed another report. He was very precise this time. He used numbers and projections and historical data on human military engagement patterns. He ended the report with 3 words. Negotiate now, unconditionally. The report sat in a queue for 2 days before anyone read it. By then, the human fleet had crossed into Vreth border space without slowing down. There was no ultimatum, no demand, no declaration of war transmitted through diplomatic channels. The fleet simply crossed the border and kept moving. High Command finally sent a communication to the Thenari Collective, requesting that they act as intermediaries and arrange a ceasefire. The Collective agreed and sent an envoy to Admiral Voss aboard the Kepler's Reach. The envoy was a Thenari diplomat named Velsora Ith, who had worked with humans before and considered them a generally reasonable species. She had prepared a careful diplomatic proposal. She sat across a table from Voss and delivered it. Voss listened to the full proposal without interrupting. When she finished, he folded his hands on the table and spoke. "Tell me where the commanders who gave the order are standing," he said. "Tell me that they will be handed over for trial. Tell me the Dominion will accept full reparation terms and permanent disarmament of their offensive fleet. If those three things are true, then we can talk about what comes after." Velsora Ith relayed the terms. The Dominion's response took 16 hours. It was not a yes. Voss read the response. Then he looked at his navigator. "Keep moving," he said. And they did. The first Vreth border fleet met the human armada at a system called Veth Karath, 3 jumps inside Dominion space. It was a significant force by any normal standard. 11,000 warships, well-armed, positioned behind a defensive line of orbital fortresses. The Vreth admiral who commanded it had fought in 2 wars and believed in his fleet's ability to hold a position. He had studied human military history. He had prepared contingency plans. None of it mattered. The engagement lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Not because the human fleet had difficulty. Because Admiral Voss had ordered precise, methodical targeting, rather than a simple, overwhelming rush. He wanted it done correctly, not just quickly. The Vreth defensive line was stripped apart systematically, the orbital fortresses disabled before they could fire more than twice, and the enemy fleet reduced to a retreating scatter of surviving ships before the Vreth admiral had time to request reinforcement. The human fleet did not pursue the survivors. They did not need to. They moved on. Alien news networks were broadcasting around the clock. The Thenari Collective had positioned observation vessels at safe distances throughout the campaign, and their footage was being shared with every civilization that had a receiver. What those civilizations saw confused many of them, because it did not match the image of human warfare they had expected. They had expected rage. They had expected the kind of scorched earth destruction that the Vreth had brought to Aurum. They expected humans to hit Vreth civilian worlds the way their own worlds had been hit. It did not happen. Human forces targeted shipyards, command stations, weapons manufacturing facilities, military communication relays, and armed vessels. They did not fire on Vreth population centers. When a Vreth world had no active military assets, the fleet passed around it and kept moving. When Vreth civilians fled in transports, the transports were scanned and allowed to go. Several neutral alien ambassadors, watching the footage, noted with something approaching bewilderment that the human fleet appeared to be conducting a military campaign with deliberate restraint. This was not softness. Voss had thought about this carefully. He understood the difference between justice and annihilation, and he had no interest in annihilation. Annihilation would make humanity into the thing it was fighting. It would mean that 4.2 million dead people had been answered with a greater number of dead people, and at the end of it all, the galaxy would simply see 2 species that killed civilians. That was not what he was here for. He was here for the people who gave the order. Everything else was the path to reach them. The Dominion tried to negotiate 3 more times as the campaign progressed over the following months. Each time, the terms offered were softer than the last, and each time they stopped short of the 3 conditions Voss had specified. They offered financial payments instead of formal reparations. They offered to put the commanding officers on trial in Vreth courts instead of surrendering them. They offered a reduction in military forces rather than disarmament. Each time, Voss read the offer and said the same thing to his communications officer. Tell them the terms have not changed. And the fleet kept moving. Skarath 4 defected in the 9th week of the campaign. He had watched High Command ignore his warnings twice. He had watched them stall in negotiations while the human fleet methodically destroyed Vreth military infrastructure, system by system. He had tried to make his superiors understand that stalling was making things worse, that every week of delay cost the Dominion more than they could afford to lose. They had not listened. They had never listened. He made contact with the Thenari Collective through a back channel that had existed for years as part of a minor trade arrangement. He offered information. The collective passed the offer to Voss. Voss accepted. What Skarath 4 provided was the location of the Dominion High Command's emergency bunker installation. It was a deep space facility built inside an asteroid at the edge of the Vreth home system, shielded, heavily fortified, and not on any chart that human intelligence had previously obtained. The High Commander, Vreth Sol the Ascendant, and the 7 senior officers who had authorized the attack on Arum had retreated there 6 weeks earlier when it became clear that the human advance was not going to stop. They had believed themselves safe there. Lieutenant Senna Okafor was assigned to the strike team that would breach the bunker. She had requested the assignment formally and in writing, giving her tactical qualifications and service record. Her commanding officer had read the request, looked at her file, and approved it without comment. Most people in the fleet understood. The strike team was 40 soldiers in 3 assault shuttles. They went in fast and quiet, using the approach vector Skarath 4 had provided, which came at the asteroid from the blind side of its sensor arrays. The outer defenses were heavier than expected, and cost them 7 minutes and 2 wounded before they got through. The inner corridors were narrower than the schematic suggested. There were 4 firefights before they reached the command level. Okafor was in the first group through the command level door. Vreth Sol the Ascendant was a large being, physically impressive in the way that leaders of aggressive civilizations sometimes are, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades being obeyed. He was standing at the far end of the room when the door came open. He pointed it at the humans coming through the door. He did not fire. Okafor looked at him across the room and felt something in her chest that was not quite anger, and not quite grief, and not quite relief. It was all of those things, and none of them. It was the end of something. She kept her own weapon aimed and took a step forward. Vreth Sol lowered his weapon. He placed it on the floor. He straightened and said something in his own language that the translation unit rendered as a formal surrender declaration. Okafor took another step forward. "Get on your knees," she said. He did. The remaining Vreth military command structure received word of the capture within 2 hours. What happened next was swift and almost anticlimactic after everything that had led to it. The Dominion's surviving fleet commanders, facing a human armada that had just taken their high command, transmitted a formal cessation of hostilities. The last Vreth warships stood down. Voss received the notification on the bridge of the Kepler's Reach. He read it. He set the report down. He looked out at the stars for a moment. Then he picked up the comm and sent one message to Earth. It was 4 words. "We have them. Coming home." It was received on 14 worlds simultaneously. In cities and stations across human space, people heard those 4 words and stopped what they were doing. Some cried, some cheered. Most simply stood still for a moment and breathed, the way people breathe when something they have been carrying for a very long time is finally set down. In a maintenance corridor on a frigate at the edge of the Vreth home system, Senna Okafor sat with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up and thought about her parents, about her brother, about the amber sky over a city that did not exist anymore. Then she got up, went back to her station, and did her job. There was still work to be done. The tribunal was held on Thenari neutral ground. in a facility built specifically for the purpose, on a moon that belonged to neither humanity nor the Vreth Dominion. This was a deliberate choice. Voss had argued for it in the initial discussions with the collective, and the Senate had agreed. They did not want the trial held on Earth, where the grief of 14 billion people would press against the walls of whatever room the proceedings took place in. They did not want it held in Vreth space, where the surviving Dominion population might view the result as an occupation ruling. They wanted it held somewhere neutral, on ground that belonged to everyone and no one, in front of witnesses from every civilized species that cared to send a representative. The gallery of observers that assembled for the trial was the largest gathering of alien diplomatic representatives in recorded history. The Thenari Collective provided interpretation services in 47 languages. Every session was broadcast live across the communication networks of a dozen civilizations. It was, by any measure, the most watched legal proceeding the galaxy had ever seen. Human prosecutors presented the case in precise, methodical order. They began with the original Vreth ultimatum and the diplomatic record that followed. They presented the timeline of the attack. They played the 11-second transmission. They showed the orbital survey footage of Arum, the glass cities, the scorched continents, the debris fields where the colony's ships had been. They introduced the final count of confirmed casualties. 4.2 million people, named wherever the records had survived. The prosecution read a portion of the names aloud on the first day. It took 3 hours and they did not finish. Vreth Sol, the Ascendant, sat at the defendant's table with his legal representation and maintained an expression that observers described as controlled. He was a being who had spent decades making decisions about the fates of others and had never expected to answer for them. The experience of sitting in a room where the full weight of one specific decision was being laid out, name by name, number by number, appeared to affect him in ways he did not entirely manage to conceal. The verdict, when it came, was unanimous across the interspecies panel of judges. Guilty on all counts. The 7 senior officers who had participated in authorizing the attack were found equally culpable. The sentence surprised the watching galaxy more than anything else that had happened in the entire conflict. Vreth Sol and the convicted officers were sentenced to permanent exile on a Vreth colony world. Not a prison world, not a labor camp. A colony, stripped of all military infrastructure and placed under permanent galactic monitoring. They would live out their lives there, under the eyes of the whole galaxy, unable to hold authority over anyone, unable to cause harm to anyone. Their names and their crime part of the permanent record that every civilization in the known galaxy would be able to access. They were not executed. This was the decision that generated the most discussion in the weeks that followed. Other species had expected humanity to demand death. Many of them would have. The Vreth had killed 4.2 million people. The expectation, based on every historical model of civilizational conflict, was that the response would include executions at the highest level. Vel Sora Ith of the Thenari Collective, who had been present throughout the tribunal, found herself in a briefing room with Admiral Voss on the last day before he returned to the fleet. She had worked with many species in her long diplomatic career and considered herself difficult to surprise. She asked him directly, "Why did you not execute them?" Voss thought about it for a moment. He was a man who thought before he answered, which the Thenari diplomat had noticed and respected over the course of their dealings. "Because we didn't come here to become them," he said. "We came here so no one would ever think they could become us." She did not have a response to that. She thought about it for a long time afterward. On a transport ship heading back toward what remained of Kepler's reach, Senna Okafor sat by a small viewport and watched the stars move. She was going back because she needed to. She had not been able to explain this to anyone in terms that felt adequate, so she had mostly stopped trying. She just needed to go back. She needed to stand on the ground, or what was left of the ground, and be present in the place where her life had been. The transport landed on the surface of Aurum 2 days later. The UEN had established a small team there, responsible for the process of designating the planet as a protected memorial world. There were survey equipment, temporary shelters, and a few dozen people working quietly and carefully. Okafor walked past all of it. She found the mural. She had seen the image Commander Osei had captured, so she knew it was there. But the image had not prepared her for standing in front of it. The wall it was painted on leaned at an angle, propped up by the collapsed structure around it, like something that had survived by accident. The paint was scorched at the edges and faded in places where heat had come close without quite touching. But the image was clear. A family in front of a house, an amber sky, birds in a line. She did not know who had painted it. She did not know if it was a child or an adult or both. She did not know what family it depicted, or whether they had been happy or worried or tired on the day it was painted. She only knew that someone had taken the time to make it. Someone had chosen those colors and put them on that wall and made something that said, "We are here, and this is our home, and it is good." She sat in front of it for a long time. She did not cry, because she had been crying, in small, quiet moments, for months, and she thought maybe she was running out of tears in the way that a well runs low after a long, dry season. But she sat there, and she looked at it, and she let it matter. Back in the Sol system, and in human colonies across 14 worlds, the fleet was standing down. Not dismantling. Never dismantling. Voss had been very clear on that point. The ships were going back into storage, fully crewed on rotating maintenance schedules, fully armed, fully operational. They were parked in their deep space dry docks, the way a tool is placed carefully back in the place where it belongs, ready to be picked up again. In diplomatic offices across the galaxy, threat assessments were being rewritten. Intelligence agencies that had classified humanity as a minor military power with peaceful inclinations were quietly updating their files. The Kethori Syndicate's Analysis Division produced a report that circulated among senior staff and was never made public. The report was 30 pages long and covered everything from human history to human psychology to human military doctrine. Its conclusion was one paragraph. It said, in the careful language of professional intelligence analysis, that humanity was a species that genuinely preferred peace, that it was slow to anger, that it operated with extraordinary patience in the face of provocation, and that it maintained its values even in the middle of war. It also said that any civilization considering a hostile action against humanity, its territories, or its people, should first consider what 700,000 warships looked like moving through space in the same direction, and ask themselves whether whatever they were hoping to gain was worth finding out. The report ended with a recommendation: do not touch what is theirs. The recommendation was, as far as anyone could tell, widely followed. Senna Okafor stayed on Aurum for 3 days. On the last morning, she walked to the mural one more time before the transport came. She stood in front of it and looked at the amber sky in the painting, and thought about the real sky that had once been